The mysterious downfall of the Mayan civilization. The Empire of Light. Long before the first European sails ever touched the horizon, deep within the emerald embrace of the Central American jungle, a radiant civilization thrived, the Maya. They were not merely builders of cities, but architects of time. With eyes fixed skyward and hearts bound to the earth, they wove the heavens into their every stone, ceremony, and symbol. Towering pyramids pierced the canopy like spears of ambition, each aligned perfectly with the stars. Their priests charted the movement of Venus with such precision that modern astronomers still marvel. Sacred texts, carved in glyphs and painted on fragile codices, told tales of gods who walked among them, of time cycles that stretched far beyond mortal imagination, and of a destiny encoded in the cosmos. At the heart of this golden age lay a prophecy, hidden deep within the Temple of the Three Flames. Passed only to the highest seers, it was whispered in the dead of night, when three suns align, a shadow shall claim the sky, and the rivers of blood shall seek their source. Most believed it to be metaphor, an allegory for cosmic balance. But others felt the pulse of something darker beneath its poetry. Among them was a humble stargazer named Aken, who would one day rise from the dust of obscurity to change the fate of an entire civilization. But for now, the empire glittered like a jewel among the trees, untouched and eternal. Or so it seemed. The rise of the Star Priest. Before the throne knew his name, Aken was nothing more than a shadow among the scholars, a stargazer of low birth, quietly tending to obsidian instruments and sacred fires in the temple of celestial rhythm. He listened more than he spoke, charted more than he prayed. But it was in that silence that he heard what others missed, the hum of something ancient stirring in the sky. One night, as the heavens performed a rare and dazzling dance, Aken saw a convergence, a triad of solar bodies aligning in defiance of expectation. It was then that he remembered the forbidden prophecy, long buried in the dust of forgotten codices: when three suns align, a shadow shall claim the sky. To some, the triple eclipse that followed was a miracle. To others, a warning. But to Aken, it was opportunity. Clad in ceremonial white, he addressed the court for the first time, not as a scribe, but as a prophet. He proclaimed the beginning of a divine rebirth, one that only he could interpret. He claimed the gods had spoken to him in fire and starlight, choosing him as their vessel. The king, desperate to unite a region slipping into rebellion, embraced him. The priesthood bowed. And the people, spellbound by celestial awe, followed. But not all were convinced. Among the elder astrologers, quiet panic grew. Aken's interpretations of the codices were selective. Glyphs were omitted, rephrased, twisted with poetic flair. Rumors ignited like dry leaves in the dry season. Had he manipulated the alignment, predicting it only after it occurred? Had he seen visions, or forged them? None dared speak aloud. For Aken, now high priest of the temple, had eyes everywhere, and the stars, he claimed, were watching. And above all, he warned, the shadow is not coming. It is already here. Blood on the altar. Prince Itzambalam, firstborn of the High King and heir to the sacred throne of Mutal, had always walked a careful line between reverence and reason. While the court worshipped Aken's every word like divine song, Itzam listened with wary silence, his mind sharper than most gave credit for. He had studied the old glyphs himself, learned from the same ancient scrolls Aken had supposedly decoded. But something wasn't right. One evening, under the blood-washed light of the lunar eclipse, Itzam found himself alone in the Temple of Night Echoes, a place rarely visited, save by the most devout. There, hidden beneath layers of prayer cloth, he uncovered a shattered codex, one that contradicted Aken's prophecy entirely. The celestial alignment had been observed centuries before, and never once associated with divine rebirth or shadowed doom. Armed with this knowledge, the prince demanded an audience with the high priest. They met beneath the great cenote, where starlight met water. Their conversation began in whispers, but quickly rose into fury. Itzam accused him of deceit, of rewriting the fate of the empire to gain power. Aken, calm yet cold, warned him, even truth becomes a lie when spoken by the unblessed. Days later, the kingdom prepared for a sacred ritual during the full blood moon. It was to be a night of cleansing and offering, a public act of devotion to the gods, orchestrated by Aken himself. But as the moon bathed the city in red, Prince Itzam did not appear. His chambers were empty. His guards, missing. And in the sacred plaza, a crimson-streaked blade lay at the foot of the altar, its obsidian tip still warm. Aken emerged with eyes glistening and hands marked with ash and oil. He said the gods had taken the prince, called him into the sky as an offering for the new age. The crowd wept and praised. But not everyone believed. In the silent corners of the temple, whispers echoed louder than chants. And deep beneath the stones of Zoltan, in corridors no priest dared walk, something stirred. Queen of Thorns. When Prince Itzum vanished beneath the blood moon, the capital city of Yaxmutal fell into ritual mourning. But the silence that followed wasn't just sorrow, it was uncertainty and fear. A kingdom without an heir was vulnerable. A kingdom without answers was weaker still. Into this vacuum stepped Princess Ixchel Balam, sister to the fallen prince, daughter of the High King, and the last flame of the royal bloodline. From the moment she entered the great hall draped in mourning jade and obsidian, all eyes turned. Her presence was both balm and blade, serene in her sorrow, yet cloaked in steel resolve. The council expected hesitation, weakness perhaps. Instead, they found a queen who met them with measured poise and unflinching command. Though still in her 20s, Chel had long watched the court from behind ceremonial veils, listening, studying, memorizing the rhythms of power. Her brother had been the golden sun, the warrior, the diplomat. She had been the quiet observer in the shadow of his flame. But that shadow had taught her where light failed, and where secrets lived. On the day of her coronation, she chose not to speak the traditional prayer to the gods. Instead, she spoke to the people, the sky may hide its stars. The jungle may claim our dead. But I will not be ruled by silence. It was a declaration and a warning. Behind her ceremonial smile, however, grief twisted like a knife. She had loved Itzum deeply, not just as a brother, but as the one person who had ever seen her not as a royal, but as a mind equal to his own. Now he was gone. Taken by a prophecy she didn't trust, on the word of a man she did not believe. And yet, she needed him. Aachen, now more powerful than ever, had the people's hearts, the priesthood's loyalty, and the sky's approval, at least on the surface. To challenge him openly would invite chaos. So, Chel did what her ancestors had always done when gods whispered and men lied. She played the long game. She smiled. She obeyed. She wove alliances among the southern city-states. She consolidated military strength beneath the guise of divine guardianship. And deep within the temple vaults, she began sending her own spies into the archives the priests had locked away. She was queen, yes, but no ruler survives without knowing where the knives are buried. She wore the crown of jade and gold, but around her heart, she wore thorns. The curse of the dying rain. The first season without rain was met with patience. The Maya were no strangers to the moods of the gods. The priests assured the people it was a test, a time of cleansing. Offerings were increased. Chants grew longer. Fires burned through the night. But when the second season came, and the rain still refused to fall, patience turned to whispers, and whispers into fear. The great cenotes, once bottomless and blessed by the sky gods, began to shrink. Crops withered beneath a sun that no longer moved in harmony with the rituals. The sacred cacao trees bore bitter fruit, and the rivers, once mapped with divine geometry, ran sluggish and dark. Aachen, now revered not just as high priest but as the voice of the sky, claimed the gods were angered. Balance must be restored, he said, his voice rising in temples choked with incense. Sacrifice is the only path to rain. And so, the altars grew wet with blood. More hearts. Younger victims. Nobler lineages. The people, frightened and starving, obeyed. After all, hadn't he predicted the triple eclipse? Hadn't the gods answered him before? But Chel, watching from her palace high above the ceremonial plaza, felt a different kind of chill, one not from the drought, but from what wasn't happening. The rituals were louder. The sacrifices greater. Yet the skies remained mute. No clouds. No wind. No signs. In private, she summoned the kingdom's last surviving hydrologists, elders once respected for their scientific knowledge before Aachen's rise had banished logic to the shadows. They spoke of signs not divine, but environmental, deforestation of sacred groves, overfarming of the maize fields, the collapse of deep soil beds. This wasn't the wrath of gods. It was the slow, predictable unraveling of a system stretched too far. But such explanations were dangerous. In a kingdom where faith ruled reason, to challenge the divine narrative was to invite heresy. And heresy, under Aachen's doctrine, was treason. And so Chel walked a razor's edge. She stood beside the priest at ceremonies, blessing the offerings with a steady hand, even as her mind spiraled into silent rebellion. She had grown up believing the gods listened. But now, as ash settled where rain once fell, a new belief took root within her, maybe the gods were never listening at all. Forbidden love, forgotten scrolls. While the kingdom prayed for rain and offered blood to a silent sky, one man fled the rituals, the chants, and the lies. His name was Teku, once a junior scribe in the royal archives, now branded a heretic for refusing to alter glyphs in the sacred codices. Quiet, brilliant, and dangerously curious, he had always been drawn not to temples, but to ruins, to what was forgotten, not what was preached. Banished from the central city and living in the fringe outposts of the southern jungle, Tekyu spent his days studying fragments of old maps and listening to oral histories passed in hushed tones by aging villagers. It was during one such expedition, deep beneath a collapsed observatory swallowed by vines, that he found the Scroll of Shadows, a brittle, worm-eaten document penned by a long-dead king whose name had been struck from every official record. The scroll spoke not of gods, but of cycles, climate rhythms, deforestation, soil collapse. It detailed how previous dynasties had pushed the land to its limit, warned of a drought pattern that would return if balance was not restored. At the bottom, in faded ochre ink, it read, "This doom is not divine. It is ours. If we fall, let it be known, the stars did not curse us. We cursed ourselves." Tekyu knew this truth could shatter the kingdom, but he could not keep it to himself. So, he made the most dangerous decision of his life. He traveled under cover of darkness and smuggled himself into Yaxmutal, using old servant routes and forgotten aqueducts. And in the shadowed chambers of the Moon Tower, he stood before Queen Ixchel. She was not the cold sovereign he expected. She listened. She asked questions. She read the scrolls 3 times in silence. And then, she smiled. Not the smile of triumph, but the fragile, flickering smile of someone who had waited far too long for a reason to hope. Over the following weeks, Tekyu remained hidden in the queen's private quarters, brought in only under moonlight, disguised as a servant. They pored over forbidden knowledge together, scrolls buried by the priesthood, records misinterpreted or intentionally erased. And in the hush of their long nights of study, affection bloomed. Slowly. Delicately. They spoke not just of science and salvation, but of futures neither dared to imagine. But love, especially between a common exile and a sovereign queen, was a crack in the empire's facade. And Akin's eyes were everywhere. Soon, a figure was seen slipping into the queen's chambers. Footsteps echoed where there should have been silence. And the royal guards, though loyal to Nine Chel, could not shield her from the eyes of the gods, or those who claimed to speak for them. The truth had been uncovered. But now, it was no longer just about scrolls. It was about survival. 7. Council of Shadows. By the time the 3rd season of drought arrived, the kingdom of Yaxmutal had become a powder keg, faith stretched thin, food stores dwindling, and unrest simmering just beneath the incense-smothered ceremonies. The people still chanted, still bowed before Akin, but their eyes had changed. Hope had begun to wither, just like the fields. Akin, ever watchful, knew control was slipping. His influence over the masses remained strong, but within the palace, a rot had begun to bloom. Whispers of Queen Nine Chel's nightly meetings. A mysterious visitor with ink-stained fingers. Unauthorized scrolls missing from the vault. Rumors that the queen no longer believed. It was time to act. In the upper chambers of the Temple of Fire, far from the ears of the people, a secret council convened, 7 lords, all highborn, all handpicked by Akin over the years. Warriors, merchants, priests. Each owed their status not to tradition, but to the high priest's favor. Together, they called themselves the Council of Shadows. Their objective was clear: preserve the illusion. At any cost. If the people stop believing in the gods, Lord Cahal growled, they'll start believing in rebellion. Worse, muttered another, they'll start believing in themselves. They agreed, the scrolls must be found and destroyed. The scribe, Tekyu, must vanish without trial. And if the queen refused to silence him, she too could be replaced. After all, succession was a fluid thing, especially in times of divine crisis. But Queen Ixchel was not blind. She knew eyes were turning toward her, that footsteps now echoed just a little too close behind her in the halls. Her food was tasted before she ate. Her guards rotated without explanation. Her advisors spoke in clipped tones. Still, she would not bend. Instead, she gave Tekyu one last command: carve it. Deep. Where even time cannot erase it. And so, under cover of darkness and hidden by loyal masons, Tekyu etched the truth into the temple itself, beneath the hall of celestial harmony, behind a false wall sealed with obsidian. A message not just to the present, but to the future: the gods did not fall. We did. Let this be remembered. But secrets, once planted, grow thorns. And by dawn, a bounty had been placed on Tekyu's head. The return of the vanished prince. The kingdom's memory had already buried Prince Itzambalam. The blood moon that took him was treated as holy scripture. Songs were written in his honor. Statues raised. And yet, his body was never found. Behind temple doors, Aachen had declared him sacrificed to the gods, chosen by divine will. But in truth, Itzum had never died. He had been exiled, dragged from the cenote chambers in silence, bound in sacred cloth, and cast beyond the edge of civilization by guards loyal only to the high priest. Aachen had offered him a choice: disappear, or die screaming. Itzum chose silence. For years he lived nameless among the outposts in the western highlands, watched the skies, listened to the voices of merchants and refugees who spoke of the queen's ascent, and the growing tyranny cloaked in holiness. He gathered what he could: old allies, scroll fragments, forbidden records saved by scholars in hiding. And in the fading months of the third dry season, as tensions neared the edge of civil collapse, he returned. It was not a grand entrance. He arrived during a lunar festival, cloaked in tattered robes, slipping through the temple crowds unnoticed until he stood beneath the obsidian statue raised in his name. There, with torchlight flickering across the gold mask of his own likeness, he pulled back his hood and declared, "I am not a martyr. I was never sacrificed. I was silenced." The plaza froze. The high priest's acolytes stared in disbelief. The crowd, confused, whispered in waves. And then came Queen Ninechel, drawn by the noise, her eyes scanning the face she hadn't seen in years, older now, leaner, carved with exile and survival. But it was him. Her brother. Alive. Tears threatened to break the iron dam behind her eyes, but she stood tall. "Prove it," she said, her voice steady. He did. From beneath his cloak, he unfurled parchments bearing the royal seal. His personal astronomy charts, dated the night before his disappearance. More still, a confession, signed by a former guard who had since died in exile, naming Aachen as the architect of the deception. The queen turned toward the temple steps, where Aachen, regal and unmoving, stood like a statue cast from moonlight and pride. "Do the gods fear truth, high priest?" she asked. "The gods," he replied coldly, "demand obedience. And obedience does not question." But the crowd was no longer listening to him. The chants that once filled the plaza had gone silent. Something deeper was taking root in the people's hearts, a reckoning. The return of the prince was not just a miracle. It was a rupture. And as the stars turned overhead, Itzum lifted his voice once more, "You worship a lie. But lies fear fire. And I bring flame." War was no longer a question. It had already begun. Fire across the temples. The sky offered no sign. No omen. No rain. Only smoke. In the weeks that followed Prince Itzum's return, the empire spiraled into open chaos. What began as whispers became marches. Temples that once echoed with chants of praise now rang with screams. Loyalists to Aachen defended their sacred cities with fire and obsidian. But across the jungle, torches rose in defiance, lit by farmers, scholars, even former soldiers who once bled for the gods. They no longer prayed. They rebelled. The kingdom fractured into two forces, those who still followed the divine word, and those who now believed in the living truth. At the center stood Queen Ninechel, torn between blood and throne. Her brother, once thought lost, now led the resistance, wielding not only the weight of truth, but the fury of betrayal. And yet, he refused to take power by force. He demanded justice, not vengeance. Let her rule, he told his followers, but let her choose the path. But Aachen, ever cunning, was not content to let history slip from his grip. From his inner sanctum within the Temple of the Three Flames, he summoned the final act, a ritual said to summon divine wrath, once performed only when a dynasty collapsed. It required one final offering, the heart of the crown. His message was clear: Ixchel must be sacrificed. But the queen had already made her decision. She met her brother in the ruins of their childhood palace, beneath the crumbling mural of their father's coronation. Her armor was ceremonial, but her sword was sharp. "If I fall, let it be on my feet. Not as a pawn, not as a priest's illusion." Together, they marched on the capital, leading separate columns of warriors, united for one final storm. The battle of the three temples would be remembered in ash and song. The plaza burned. The walls cracked. Obsidian altars shattered beneath the weight of civil war. Aachen stood atop his altar as the heavens turned black with smoke, chanting, screaming, calling upon gods that no longer answered. "I gave them order," he shouted to the sky. "You gave them chains," Itzum answered from below. And in the final clash, it was not a blade that ended the age. It was silence. For as Aachen raised his arms to the sky one last time, the moon eclipsed. The crowd fell to their knees, expecting fire, thunder, something. But nothing came. No voice. No vision. No divine fury. Only wind. Cold, dry, and empty. And for the first time in generations, the people realized, the gods were gone. A betrayal written in the stars. When the smoke cleared, and the screaming ceased, the once mighty empire of the Maya lay in ruins. Temples that had stood for centuries were nothing more than skeletons of stone. The jungle began to reclaim what had been stolen from it. And the people, those who remained, stood silent, not in mourning, but in awakening. The high priest Aken was gone. His body was never found. Some claimed he was swallowed by the gods he once spoke for. Others whispered he fled into the mountains, mad with silence, chanting to a sky that no longer answered. Queen Ixchel, too, vanished into legend, last seen walking barefoot through the scorched gardens of her childhood, her crown left on the altar her brother had refused to burn. But history, as always, left more questions than answers. Years passed. Generations turned. The jungle thickened, swallowing temples whole. Time buried the truth in vines and silence. The world moved on. Until, in the modern age, an international archaeological expedition equipped with LiDAR technology scanned the dense forests of northern Guatemala, and discovered what no human eyes had seen in 1,000 years. A massive hidden city. Entire neighborhoods. Roads. Observatories. And beneath one particular temple, a sealed chamber, untouched. Inside, engraved in stone, was a message written in 3 languages, encoded in astronomical diagrams, mythic symbols, and something strangely mathematical. It was Teku's carving. Preserved. Waiting. This was no divine fall. It was engineered. A migration, hidden as a myth. Not to flee death, but to preserve truth. In that chamber, archaeologists uncovered records of a secret sect of astronomers who had seen the collapse coming decades before it began. Not prophets, but scientists. They knew the droughts would return. They knew the soil would fail. And they knew the priesthood, drunk on power, would never let that truth reach the people. So they hid their knowledge. They disappeared. Not by force, but by design. Entire cities were evacuated under the guise of spiritual ascension. Populations guided by coded star maps, away from the epicenter of collapse. The myth of divine punishment had been created as a cover story, a way to explain the inexplicable, to protect those who survived from persecution by those who stayed behind. The final betrayal was not by the gods. It was by those who claimed to speak for them. The downfall of the Maya was not a mystery of fate, nor a punishment from the heavens. It was a carefully orchestrated lie, crafted to protect the truth from power, and power from the truth. And as the jungle echoed with the hum of new machines and camera flashes, one final carving caught the light: if you find this, then the stars have returned. And we are watching.